Hello. Yama in my language. Hello. My presentation today is pretty much about who we are as a people and fostering relationships and getting to know each other on another level so we can move together into the future in a really good way. And the biggest part of my talk today is about stories and how we all have a story to tell and we all have a story that needs to be listened to. This is just a map which is part of all of our story. A map of Australia, and where the yellow arrow is pointing is my country, the Kamilaroi people, also known as the Gomeroi people. And as you can see, there's 500 Aboriginal tribal groups within this nation, all separate nations within themselves, and 700 plus language groups. So people tend to think that Aboriginal people were just one group of people, but as you can see, it was like 500 nations within a nation. Just a little bit about my personal story, my tribal story. We have what we call a skin group within each of the tribal groups. Up in the Northern Territory, they have up to 8 different groups within the one tribe. Over these parts of the eastern seaboard are mostly 4. So each of these skin groups determines who marries who, so bloods weren't close. It also determined what foods we could eat, so one particular animal wasn't depleted. So I belong to the Murray skin group, and the Murray is actually the male side of this, and mother is the woman. So the totem for that particular group is the Sangawena. So everybody that's in the Sangawena skin group isn't allowed to eat Sangawena. We could eat the carpet snake, the kangaroo, emus, whatever, but not our own totem. So that ensured that that one animal wasn't depleted. And it went for the same for everybody. And the third line there, they're the same names, but how they're used today. So you might hear of these names around the place. There's Murray, Combo, Cubby and Hippi. And, but their original pronunciations were Combo, Cubby and Hippi. In traditional Aboriginal culture, and this goes for the entire continent, it's not just specific to my particular group, but our God, I don't really particularly like the word God, but our creator is called Bayami. And under Bayami, all of these things fall within the law. Everything was attached to a law, and it's really a shame that mainstream Australia has been really ripped off with the education about what Aboriginal people had. Unfortunately, some people still see us as primitive, and that we were actually saved from ourselves. That we were just wandering around in search of food, but we had such a rich culture. And I would say that we are the first greenies, the environmentalists, and I'll show you a little slide down the track about how that plays out. But all of these things come under law, the law of creation. We believe, as the Native American Indians do, that everything is connected and related. So you might often hear my people and Native American people say that they're at one with that tree, or at one with the, that animal, buffalo, kangaroo. And we'll call it a brother or a sister, because we actually believe that we get a chance to be in all of the realms. In this life I might be a human, in my next life I could be a geological formation, you know, a tree or a part of a mountain. The life after that, I could be an animal of some sort. So for me to harm any of those things, I'm actually harming a relative. So that's why we never, we had a real respect for the natural environment. William Stanner is probably the only anthropologist that I believe that has, you know, really unpacked Aboriginal culture. And other anthropologists that have studied us, and we are probably one of the most overstudied, over-researched, over-whatever peoples in the world, and they still don't know what we're about. But William Stanner, he believed, after living amongst different Aboriginal groups right across Australia, that the whole business of being Aboriginal was to unite hearts and restore order. So within our groups, we made sure that, you know, even after a natural disaster, we would ritualise and ceremonialise that particular situation to bring everything back into balance again. And other anthropologists, unfortunately, that came in to study us, that had this primitive, thought about us, because they thought we were primitive, they never even bothered to look or you know, validate that there might be something there, even deeper and richer. So it was totally ignored or just skipped over altogether. And unfortunately, during the colonisation process of this country, we have had lost the ability to ceremonialise and ritualise all the pain that we were going through. So you can see today Aboriginal people are in a pretty bad way because of this compounded pain and trauma that hasn't been dealt with. Or if it is being dealt with, it's inappropriate. It's an outside group of people deciding what is best for us and how we could best tackle it. But it is improving. Just some facts about Aboriginal people. We have the oldest ceremonial burial in the world. So that's like, you know, a proper ritual, a proper process. And it's dated at 61 to 65,000 years old. And that's found down at Lake Mungo, which is a woman who is 27 years old they've discovered. The oldest boomerang was discovered in the world, and it's dated at 10,200 years, which was found in South Australia. And just the making of the boomerang itself, you have to have a knowledge of aerodynamics. So there was, you know, a lot of trial and error in there of getting our implements and tools together that wasn't just a stick you could throw. The oldest stone axes in the world, 35, 32 and 23,000 years old, found in Northern Territory and Queensland. So the tool technology. We have the oldest paintings in the world, which over in Western Australia in the Kimberley area has depicted boats and sea vessels. So they had a good knowledge as well around sea navigation. There's evidence through art and oral history that my people took notice to the moon phases and the stars and, you know, all that sort of stuff, which is a science today. So they were pretty on top of a lot of things. And these points really do need to be valid. And, you know, we often hear the argument from mainstream Australia that, you know, oh, well, if you weren't colonised, you wouldn't have all that you've got. We had a lot that was actually taken. So, you know, like I say, a lot of this stuff needs to be validated. And it's all about us sitting together in a good way and hearing each other's stories, because we do all have a story to tell. We have a traumatic story as the first people who arrived here, Westerners. Aboriginal people now are only getting a grip on their traumatic past that brought them here in the first place. And, you know, both sides of this story really do need to be validated so we can, you know, move together in a good way. Just to point out a couple of differences between us. Here's a Western view of just life itself. I'm not saying that today that everybody, you know, from the Western world thinks in this way, but at some point in the past it was, that men are actually at the top of the scale, and women would fall under them, and then children. Then we have animals, and then the plants, and then the earth itself. The Indigenous way, and this is not just people here in this country, but Indigenous people all around the world, have this view where the earth is actually on top, the plants come under that, then the animals, and then man. Because out of all of these things, you know, the plants don't need man to survive. The animals don't need man to survive. And the earth doesn't need man to survive. So man is the most dependent of those people, so he should be respecting those things. Because, yeah, that's where those three things support him. So he needs to get up on his high horse and work through that. That's just another map of the same yarn, where the ego is getting in the way of ego. So we all have our stories. My background's in, as it said at the beginning, transgenerational trauma, which is the transmission of trauma through the generations. I was talking earlier at lunch that sometimes when Aboriginal people try to talk to this stuff, it's a really difficult conversation to hear. It is painful, and some people feel like they're being blamed, but it's still a conversation that we need to have in a really good way. And also validating the other person's story. Like, I do know that some of the first convicts that came here were tagged as criminals for stealing bread, just to feed their families, you know? So I understand that, and I could imagine the amount of trauma that that person would be sitting on to endure that long journey over here in horrible conditions, you know, being treated really badly, flogged, all that sort of stuff. So I get that, and more Aboriginal people are opening up to that side of the story. And we'd like the same, so we all get to sit and hear each other's stories. So the work that I do is about wellness and healing. And it's a combination of traditional Aboriginal processes as well as other Indigenous groups around the world, Maori, Native American, Hawaiian. So therapeutic responses to pain and trauma that we've collated and collected together and combined it with Western psychology. So it has a theory base as well. So in order to heal and move forward together, we need to educate ourselves about ourselves. So I know that even as an Aboriginal woman, and that's how I identify, I know that both my grandmothers, both sides, my father's mother, her last name was McGrady, and my mother's mother, her last name was McPherson. When we did a history check on all of that, we found that only 2 McPhersons came over on the boat, one of the first fleets. And I often joke that me and Elle McPherson are cousins. Can't you tell? Yeah, so it's really interesting to look into that side of my history as well. But also through some of my research, I found that I have German and Chinese. Around the St George area where my grandfather is from, there used to be an Aboriginal camp because they were fringe dwellers, a Indian camp and a Chinese camp. And the Chinese and Indian people used to grow the fruit and vegetables, and the Aboriginal people would collect the meat and they'd all share. But apparently they were sharing more than food. A bit of DNA. So, yeah, educating ourselves is about educating ourselves. So knowing that, you know, there's a lot of research now that shows that we actually have cellular memory. That memory lives within our DNA. So I'd like to know my German history. I already know a bit of it about the Holocaust, so I know that that pain is embedded in my own very tissues. The pain of my Aboriginal ancestors. And the Chinese, they came here too and were treated pretty horribly, you know, hard workers and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of pain there, and unless we delve into it and discover it and move through it, it's always going to reside in our bodies, and we're going to pass it on to our kids in some form or another, whether it's verbally or just from our behaviour. So the word we use when we do this training is educaring, which is a Latin word meaning to rear up, to show the kids to move forward in a good way. So that's how we share our stories. It will, hopefully you come away from this presentation thinking about your own personal story and, you know, what makes you up. I'd just like to read this little bit here. So, as I said before, everything's about, you know, everything's interconnected and interrelated. Stories are our law. Stories give us identity as they connect us and fulfill our senses of belonging. Stories are grounding, defining, comforting and embracing. Stories vary in their purpose and content, and so stories can be political and equally healing. Stories can be shared verbally, physically or visually. Their meanings and messages teach, admonish, tease, celebrate, entertain, provoke and challenge. To know your story is to know who you are related to and the depths of this relatedness. Without your stories, you don't know who you are. Just a little bit more about the Aboriginal side of things. Our culture is one of the most person-centred cultures in the world. That was one of the arguments when the first Europeans rocked up here, was that, you know, you haven't built any buildings, you haven't got any agriculture going, and, you know, where's your priorities and all of that? But actually the centrepiece of our communities was our children. And if you take notice to what's happening in the press today about our kids, they are so angry and clogged up with so much pain, compounded pain, they don't even know why they're angry. Once upon a time, you know, even me as an Aboriginal woman could be assured that if I came across some Aboriginal youth down a dark lane at night, that I'd be safe. These days, it's no guarantee, because there's, you know, they're acting out the trauma in their bodies, and the responses to these kids is so inappropriate. One of the things that the Western medicine does when people are acting out their trauma is that they spear them either, sorry I use that word too loosely, spear them, they direct them in either one of two ways. And one is through the mental health system, which unfortunately is about sedating people and not allowing the story to come out. And that's what these kids are doing. They've got a story to tell, but nobody's listening. It's about quietening them down, and it's not for their sake, it's for our sake. You know, so we feel comfortable. The other side of that, if they're not thrown into the mental health system, is they throw them into the judicial system, the legal system, where they flog the word rehabilitation to death but have no concept about what it really means. So they go into juvenile detention or jail and come out worse because the trauma's not addressed. And so I could say that they're not responding to mainstream Australia, let alone Indigenous Australia. So a biomedical model needs a whole new overhaul, because it's about looking at the person holistically and seeing everything that's going on. You can't just pull one little bit out and try to work on that. I get really irritated when I see like a stop gambling program or a stop smoking program, or nobody's looking at why they started in the first place. You can't treat a symptom unless you look at the initial pain, yeah. So yeah, we're the oldest environmentalists in the world, because as you know, we are the oldest surviving continuous culture in the world. My people debate the out of Africa theory. We believe that people spread out from here, actually. The proof's there. Proof's there. We have one of the most complicated kinship systems. I'm 50 years old and I'm still working out some of it. I often joke if I were to take a family portrait, we'd have to hire out a footy field and take an aerial shot. It's the only way you're going to get everybody into the picture. We had processes and practices in place that dealt with ill health. And so that's been severely disrupted during the colonisation process. So no wonder people are, in a bad way. And so much money, and this gets thrown back on us all the time too, but so much money gets thrown at these black fellas, why don't you get your shit together? We haven't any really say in how that response is for us, Our Aboriginal health workers themselves are trying to deal with Aboriginal people when they've got the same issues, so we're just going around in this bloody cycle and circle that has no end. But hopefully through the work that we're doing, we've got a master's degree in transgenerational trauma that was run at Southern Cross University in Lismore for 12 years, of which I lectured in. We got about 90 graduates out of that. And they're sort of situated all around Australia. And it's started again in another form down at Wollongong University, so check that out if you'd like. So understanding our trauma story and worldwide colonisation's on. And there's a beautiful picture there that's not showing up, only a white tie. But it's a picture of a man pointing down at somebody that's bowing down to them. So Australia was a prison colony, had the subjugation and abuse of the original peoples, and it created culturally unsafe living and learning environments. It's a shame because the picture's pretty. So, colonisation as traumatisation. We have generational, historic and collective complex social and cultural trauma. The physical violence of the frontier. There was epidemics, starvations and massacres. I was saying that, that I'm from the Kamilaroi, and our most infamous massacre was the Mile Creek Massacre. Also in that same area we have Slaughterhouse Creek, Gravesend. There's probably about 5 others, but really big populations of Kamilaroi people were decimated for land. The structural violence of the state, so people getting put on reserves, missions, the legislation, government surveillance and interventions. I found it interesting that talk earlier, Brian, is it? about the Constitution. If you see what our stance is within the Constitution, it's horrific because we're seen as a people who need to have laws, special laws and special decisions made on behalf of us because we haven't that ability ourselves. So it's quite racist. And I would say to you today, my little plug for us is if we ever do have this referendum about being recognised in the Constitution, say no. Vote no. Vote no. Okay, this is what we call a sixth generation traumagram. And we use this within the Masters of Indigenous Wellbeing, where we believe that, in our training, we believe that if you were to become a counsellor or a helper, that you need to look at your own story. Because mainstream psychology doesn't require you to do your own work, it just requires you to learn the theory and go out and fix people. So an example of that would be, just say if I was counselling a lady who had been raped, and that's my own story, and I haven't worked through it. How can I, give her the tools or whatever to get through her own stuff when I haven't got through my own? So I'm informing her from my own place. So we need to do our own work, and one of these maps is what we have to do within the course. So we trace back where things entered the equation, drug and alcohol abuse, sexual assault, sexual violence, whatever. So this is how it's played out. If we could imagine right up the top there, that's on, the colonial frontier between 1860 and 1930. We would have a non-Aboriginal man with an Aboriginal woman, and we don't deny that some unions were mutual, but there is the reality that Aboriginal women were stolen and used as partners. So there was violence within that. So if we can imagine that union there was like that, we have 10 odd kids there, and this is actually a real family actually. These kids have witnessed violence. They've probably witnessed sexual assault. So the research shows today that you don't have to experience these things on yourself, but just the being able to hear violence actually traumatises a child. They don't even have to be witness to it. We know that through this union, whether you're male or female, you will come out with some damage. So generally the boys, if no interventions are taking place, generally the boys would be much like their fathers, either violent or drinking, whatever, to deaden their own pain. And the women were more likely to be submissive and get partners like their fathers. So the cycle continues. But other things enter the equation by this stage. We've got sexual assault, physical violence, drug and alcohol use, and mental illness. Mental illness could be just depression. So you can see where I'm going with that. With each generation, without any intervention, the cycle continues, and with each generation it actually gets worse. So right down the bottom here, we've got a 10-year-old boy who's attempting suicide because of all the things he's had to witness and stuff. I know this sounds pretty heavy and down, but it will improve. So, just for Aboriginal people, we've had to live through and endure policy after policy after policy from the government. So we've been through all of these things: colonisation, annihilation, dispossession. Then they wanted to protect us, then segregate us, then integrate us, then assimilate us, then it started to shift to self-determination, reconciliation, which is not a really good word because reconciliation means to mend something that was good in the first place. It wasn't good in the first place. Intervention, and now we're down to recognition. So I can say that we're all shunned out. I'm actually trying to get some teenage boys to write a hip hop song saying we're all shunned out. So trauma ruptures our connections to ourselves, physically, emotionally, mentally and vitally, to others, to our families, social group, generation and culture, and to nature, instinctually and environmentally. So, just some of the symptoms, signs and symptoms of trauma. And like I say, I'm talking to this from an Aboriginal perspective, but trauma is trauma. It doesn't matter where you come from in the world. We all respond to it in the same way. And so this is relative to you as well. You lose a deep mistrust of self and others, even within the family. Self-directed violence, suicide, risk-taking behaviour, substance misuse, violence against women, unremitting grief. Just on that one, with Aboriginal people, traditionally we had, like I said, processes and practices in place to get you through stuff. So our grief ceremonies would last up to a year. And now we're having 6 deaths a month. So we're never on top of our grief, so it's just sitting there. Shame and humiliation, intergenerational conflict, cultural genocide, losing traditional values, desecrating land and institutions. We have a leadership crisis, and there's a conspiracy of silence, an overall attitude of secrecy. So even Aboriginal people themselves now even though they know that things are not right within their communities because of their mistrust of services and the government and processes, they're sitting on and protecting themselves even though it's not a good thing. This research comes out of South America, but is valid for any colonised group around the world. So this is 5 generations. In the first generation, males were killed, imprisoned, and the females sexually misused. Second generation, men took to alcohol and drugs as their cultural and spiritual identity is damaged and their self-worth. The third generation, we saw spousal assault or societal trauma. Fourth generation, the abuse moves from spousal to child abuse or both. When I say child abuse, that's not just sexual but neglect. Fifth generation, cycle repeats as trauma begets violence begets trauma. So what we're seeing now is the grown children of the conquerors are beginning to live in fear of the children of the conquered. And, we're trying to inform government now that if they don't act soon and start doing the appropriate responses, what they're actually doing is breeding a generation and future generations of terrorists, homegrown terrorists, because these kids, these young ones are so angry and chock-a-block with pain and not getting the proper response, they're just going to go mad. So that's the work that me and my cohorts are doing at the moment. And the more educating we can do around this stuff, the better, and hopefully get things happening. So collective trauma. Erickson defines collective trauma as the blow to the basic tissues of social life that damage the bonds attaching people together and impairing the prevailing sense of community. A gradual realisation that the community no longer exists as a source of nurturance, and that part of the self has disappeared. The effects of complex trauma, if unresolved, powerfully impacts mental and physical health. So the majority of people, over 90% treated by the public mental health system and substance abuse services have trauma histories. And it's like, duh. Another cohort of mine has done her PhD with male prisoners that are in jail for life that will never be released and are in jail for the most horrific, heinous crimes. And this is not just Aboriginal men, but all men. And 100% of those men have trauma stories that were never heard. All of these blokes were severely traumatised by the age of 5, and their crimes actually replicate what had happened to them. So, I mean, I'm not endorsing or anything they've done, but I understand that if, the appropriate responses weren't there and nobody got to hear their stories, they are victims too. And a lot of our work we do around the brain, the development of the brain, especially in children. And the research shows that if any child has been severely traumatised by the age of 5, a part of their brain, which is located at the back, is where empathy develops. And through trauma, it just shuts down and you don't go into learning mode, you go into survival mode. So that's all that hypervigilant stuff, and you don't learn how to care for others. And 100% of psychopaths that do all these horrible things have those trauma stories for, before they were 5-year-old. So, the brain development, that's why our kids really need to be nurtured. So when unresolved, complex trauma causes ongoing problems, intergenerational effects, and in society as a whole. So people, often complain about where their taxes go in supporting people, and if the government really got a grip on what needs to happen, we'll all be in a better place, that's for sure. So transgenerational trauma has impacted on our health and well-being. We have compounded trauma that we have not been able to recover from, and our responsibilities to land have been severely interrupted and sadly neglected, in combination with our lack of access to our significant sites on country. And as Aboriginal people, we believe that if we are unwell, the land becomes unwell, or if the land is unwell, we too become unwell. So, under Biami, our law, we have an obligation to care for country. And one of the first things that happened to us as a people was being shifted off country to make way for the agricultural industry. I was at a Beyond Coal and Gas talk down at Myuna early this year, and I spoke down there. I actually presented the same presentation. And at the end of it, we had about 5 different farmers who made a MOU with us that they would unlock their gate for us to be able to continue our obligation to the land. We don't want to take over your farms and pitch up a tent in your backyard or any of that stuff. We just want to fulfil our obligations to country. And if any farmers here want to do that, it's all for the benefit of us all at the end of the day. When responsibles are not respected and cared for, the natural elements will take over. So bushfires, floods and droughts. So this is just a bit about compounded pain and how we disconnect from our pain because it is too painful, and we all do this. So life experiences, one's losses and grief, and it damages our spirit. So it leaves voids within us. So there's holes that these voids need to be filled up, and we generally do them with drugs or alcohol, coffee, working, bad relationships, drama, anything to shift the focus of what's really going on in our lives. We'll use all these different things, and we all do it. Bad relationships. I know people who might have a really drama-free existence for a little while, but will create dramas just to keep going. So that's because there's a void there that hasn't been filled. So the damaged spirit is incapable of even identifying a problem under the many layers of pain, let alone finding a solution to all of that. And we've come up with this term where the pain results in what we call self-aside. So that's, just having a cigarette. It's killing yourself slowly. Caffeine, risky behaviour, whatever. Self-aside then can lead to suicide, and suicide to homicide. The good stuff now. Shake off all that heaviness. But this is what actually heals, and it's been proven. There's so much research these days to show that, look, once upon a time ago it was thought that once you had trauma in your lives, you couldn't renegotiate the trauma in your brain, that it was just stuck. But the trauma experts all around the world now are validating Indigenous processes and practices, what we were doing before colonisation. And that's through the most simplest things like sitting around yarning, circle work, sharing the stories, because there's a whole lot of... If we all sat in a circle, you imagine the amount of knowledge and, all the different stories that could be told here of how certain people got through certain situations in their life. That's a wealth of information, just sitting in a circle, being able to share that. And Aboriginal people did that on a daily basis. So it's sharing stories in reflective practice, what works, what doesn't work, what we know from our lived experience, and now being able to link that to the theory, the psychological theory. Art, we know that people who have been severely traumatised aren't able to verbalise it. That's why we see them acting out, because the body never forgets. The body always remembers, and the body speaks what the voice can't. So in a cultural context, we were quite crafty and arty people. Individually and doing stuff collectively. Music and dance, the corroborees. Psychodrama, which is, role-playing, acting out. Ceremonies for emotional release. My last position, I worked at a drug and alcohol rehabilitation centre, and I was saying to the management that, it's all well and fine to have these blokes sober while they're here, but unless you're doing the trauma work, within a month of getting out, they can find themselves back in the same cycles because they haven't worked through their trauma. And a lot of the blokes, we know that being unwell, being mentally unwell, anger in particular with the men, anger is a secondary emotion, so there's always something under it, and there's generally two things, which is fear and grief. So I was taking these blokes through a process, which is the traditional process, where it's a release of the anger. And some of the blokes would say to me, look, if I get angry now, I might kill somebody, I'll punch somebody out. But I'd explain that if I had a bottle of water here and it's got so much water in, as I pour it out, it's getting less. So by that discharge, they can't get any more angry, they're emptying out. So they would go to it, get into it. What I'd do is I'd give them a towel and just letting them swing it, you know, and letting the anger rise for themselves. And before they knew what they were doing, they were like bashing the shit out of whatever was there. And it had this great discharge. But as soon as that anger was released, they'd start to cry, because once that was stripped away, there was either all of this grief or all of this fear. So, yeah. And then the traditional healings with massage, we know that there's lots of science to back it up, that through massage you can unblock the crystallised trauma that lays in your body and have it released as well. And a lot of the times that we don't even know what our trauma stories are. There could be multiple stories, because we're not only carrying the trauma of our own lived experience, we're carrying the trauma of our parents and our grandparents and so on, because our parents raised us in a certain way and from their own trauma place. So some of that stuff's rubbed off. And it's about unpacking all of that. So this is just a response to the last one. So educaring is about creating a culturally safe place. When I say culturally safe, that doesn't just mean a specific culture, but we need to be able to find a place for people to feel safe enough to tell their stories. And it might not even be verbal, it might be just through art. So finding and telling our stories, we use a whole heap of different processes to try to find that trauma story within us through drawing and whatever. Then we have to make sense of that story. You know, really unpack it, break it down, what was happening to the other person at that time, all of that stuff matters. The other thing is feeling the feelings. I'll tell this quick story about my ex-partner who was from up Weber, who was a community police officer, very caring and loving person, but had a really traumatic childhood story of abuse. His whole family used to physically slap him around and use him as a punch bag. The only one in his family that didn't was his mum, and she died at the age of when he was 16. And when he reached the age of 16, he was physically able to protect himself from his brothers and sisters so he could fight back. But anyway, he made it to a place within himself that he forgave everybody in his family. And to this day, he continues to have heart attack after heart attack after heart attack, because we know that trauma manifests itself into something physical if you don't get rid of it. And I told him, you will never stop having these heart attacks until one kills you, or you sit in the feelings of what they did to you. Because it's all well and fine to forgive them, but unless you sit in the pain of what they did to you, you'll never get through it. And then the fifth stage of that is moving through the layers of loss and grief and ownership of it. Like, are we going to let ourselves be defined by what happened to us, or we're going to come to a place of acceptance that yes, this has happened, but I've got to move through it and get over it. And if you look at that from an Aboriginal perspective, losses isn't just about a physical person, but we've lost a lot. We've lost land, language, stories, people, the whole shebang there. But we're getting back. And the final step of that is reclaiming who we were meant to be, who we were born to be. So reclaiming our own identities. And just Quick little talk on cultural safety, because this is one of the things that we need to learn when we want to work with other people. We're way beyond cultural awareness at the moment, because you could be culturally aware but still not sensitive to that other person's difference. And there's being culturally sensitive and finding the place of being culturally safe. That's the outcome we're looking for. So cultural awareness is a beginning step towards understanding that there is a difference. Workshops can be designed to facilitate an awareness of the emotional, social, economical, political and environmental context in which people exist. Cultural sensitivity alerts people to the legitimacy of difference and begins a process of self-exploration as the powerful bearers of their own life experience and realities, and the impact this may have on others. Cultural safety, it's an environment that is spiritually, socially and emotionally safe, as well as physically safe for people. It is about shared respect, shared meaning, shared knowledge and the experience of learning together. But the biggest thing is that we need to believe that healing is possible. And this is a quote from a trauma expert that works at Harvard University and is an Italian man called Richard Mollica. So this force, which lies within us all, is the biological, psychological and social power of self-healing, that innate capacity possessed by all human beings to restore their physical and mental self to a state of full productivity and quality of life, no matter how severe the initial damage. Thank you.